Is malaria caused by demons? Should I let the guy standing next to me on the subway cough directly into my mouth? And will a diet rich in non-seed oils and raw milk protect my child from the measles? Hi, and welcome to Public Health History class, where we'll be answering all those questions and more. I'm Lola, and I'll be leading today's lecture because the regular professor has shingles again. Air. It's everywhere. It surrounds and sustains us. The fluid of life, or the other fluid of life, I guess. Air is technically a fluid. You know that, right? And it is full of bits of life and other stuff. Soot from car exhaust, pine pollen, birch pollen, grass pollen, rumors, and germs. Or, put more technically, infectious respiratory particles, aka viruses and bacteria riding around in minuscule bits of moisture created when someone talks or stares silently at you on the bus, which are now surfing the air currents where they can be inhaled by someone else and, depending on the circumstances, make them sick. This happens with all sorts of bugs: influenza, tuberculosis, SARS-CoV-2, and no, right? Isn't it obvious that germs can float out of one person through the air and into another person, making them sick? Apparently not. In fact, it's so not obvious that shockingly few people seem to understand or care about the specifics of airborne disease transmission today. The fact that airborne pathogens can float in indoor air much further than 6 feet or 2 meters, and they can infect people right next to each other or remain aloft and viable for hours in the right conditions, which means that those plastic supermarket barriers and face shields early in the COVID pandemic never made sense. And this might actually be the primary way a number of diseases are transmitted rather than through infected surfaces, but people don't know this, including ones that you kind of assume would, like cancer doctors, or people who design schools for children, or people who design cancer doctors for children. While you may have heard that people in London used to drink water full of and industrial runoff directly out of the River Thames, you probably don't realize that the air we breathe in public indoor places meets the same standards for not being full of dangerous as this drinking water used to, namely, no standards. And I say used to because water is treated now to make it safe to drink in London, as in many, but not remotely all, places around the world. And we could be doing the same thing with public indoor air so people don't get sick with transmissible illnesses nearly as often, or develop chronic conditions from long-term exposure to environmental pollutants, which are just as much inside as out, because smog is not like a vampire that needs to be invited indoors. The bottom line is we would all be better off if infrastructure was updated to provide cleaner indoor air in public places using technology that is already well understood and known to be safe, like ventilation, filtration, and certain applications of ultraviolet light. And some experts have been recommending these sorts of upgrades for years now. It's just not happening, except in the private homes of the ultra-affluent and some workplaces of wealthy governments, of course. And if you're wondering,
but what's your source?
My source list is actually linked in the description. There are some historical scientific works, contemporary government and institutional records, this big old book, and lots of peer-reviewed academic journal articles. There are nearly 100 citations in this video. There has been an explosion of amazing work in this field in the last few years by physicists, biologists, historians, engineers, and more. There's a book by one of the world's best science writers inspired by this recent work, and there have been episodes from some of the most popular science podcasts in the world about the book book about the work of the physicists and biologists. However, all of this more mainstream coverage has what seems to me a puzzling lack of urgency. It's missing a certain je ne sais why are we unnecessarily letting children get repeatedly infected with diseases we know are harming them when we already have the technology to prevent it. And read children to people who are like, oh, kids just get sick all the time. That's just how it is. Literally, no. This is a design issue that could be solved with existing technology. And even though the first scientists to point out how bad the air in schools and other public places was did so almost 100 years ago, very little has changed. It's frustrating. I'm frustrated. And it turns out that the whole history of the science of airborne disease transmission is bizarre and frustrating. So, together, we're gonna dive deep into science history to untangle this twisted tale to try to figure out what the f***'s gone wrong at so many different points in history all the way up to the present, because things are for sure not gonna get better if no one even understands the problem. And things can get better. Let's go. Now, this is such a complex topic that touches on so many threads. The Roman Empire, the AIDS epidemic, the controversial practice of hand washing, and the unbearable ambiguity of words. So instead of approaching it head on, we're going wide, coming in at an angle, and looking first at some public health figures. Many of them sure were ahead of their time and not fully appreciated while alive. So we could begin with this guy, Girolamo Fracastoro, who all the way back in Renaissance Italy was the first to clearly propose that disease can spread from person to person via some sort of tiny, invisible seeds. But did he ultimately manage to convince everyone of his theory? No. It's hard to blame people at this point. Fracastoro didn't really have evidence for his idea, and he was mostly known in his time for his 3-volume epic poem about syphilis, which, to his credit, is indeed caused by the bacteria Treponema pallidum being passed between people via contact. People of Girolamo's time liked his poetry, but the idea that diseases can spread between people just didn't catch on full force yet. Because, obviously, disease is caused by miasma. So, okay, instead of Fracastoro, how about, yes, this guy. More scientific method, decent evidence, fewer rhymes. It's much tidier, narratively. This is Ignaz Semmelweis, a physician from 1840s Vienna who proposed a healthcare idea so radical that he was ridiculed by his contemporaries and eventually died in an asylum following a breakdown. Do you know what his wild idea was? Yes, his idea was that doctors should disinfect their hands before delivering babies to reduce rates of maternal death due to childbed fever, especially when they were delivering babies with their bare hands directly after dissecting corpses with their bare hands. But Semmelweis's experiments requiring physicians to rinse with a chlorine solution prior to deliveries greatly reduced deaths. And while he didn't know exactly why it worked, he thought the incredible results spoke for themselves. Doctors should definitely start washing their hands. Did his colleagues agree? No, of course not. They were doctors. They were gentlemen. And according to a leading obstetrician at the time, gentlemen's hands
are clean.
Also, everyone knew that childbed fever was either just plain bad luck or the result of miasmas in the home environment of some of the poor women who visited Semmelweis's clinic. Despite his best efforts to convince doctors throughout Europe of the benefits of hand washing, Semmelweis was never believed in his lifetime. After his ideas were rejected in Vienna, he moved back to his hometown of Pest, where he tried to publish a treatise on hand washing, and was so ridiculed that he had a breakdown and was locked in an institution where he was beaten by the guards and then died of sepsis. Ironically, the same complication of infection he was trying to prevent. All for the idea that doctors should wash their hands, a concept that most of his fellow physicians didn't like. It is for this reason that long after his death, the term Semmelweis reflex was coined to describe a knee-jerk reaction where people violently reject new ideas despite good evidence when they contradict their pre-existing beliefs. But surely the Semmelweis reflex doesn't come into play anymore because we're so much better as a society at accepting convincing evidence that goes against our previous beliefs and then changing our behavior accordingly, right? No, of course not. This is foreshadowing about the airborne transmission thing. But we'll get back to that. Hold it in your heads for now because first we need to go back to look at this. Fracastoro and Semmelweis couldn't convince people of their ideas 400 years apart because the same concept was more popular: miasma. So, what the hell is miasma? Yes, good job. Miasma, or bad air, was the prevailing Western concept of disease transmission for thousands of years. First put forth by Hippocrates of oath fame, it held that bad smells caused by rotting organic material literally caused disease through various underexplained mechanisms. This is why plague doctors wore those weird masks. The purpose of the beak was to hold nice smells to counteract the bad smells they thought caused disease. Personally, I like peppermint, chamomile, and a dash of apple cider vinegar. Oh, you want to try? Sure. The best plague doctor. But will masking a bad smell with a pleasant smell help you avoid disease? No. But compared to earlier ideas, like, for example, that the fevers of malaria were caused by demons, miasma as the cause of disease makes a bit more sense. Fun fact, malaria literally means bad air. It was their belief in miasmas that led ancient Romans to drain many marshes and swamps, which are indeed not the greatest smelling biomes. And although marsh stink wasn't the real cause of malaria, draining the swamps did reduce rates of the disease. Why? Yes. Gold star to the bloodsucker. Okay, so draining the swamps to get rid of miasmas also reduced the habitat for mosquitoes, the real carriers of the single-celled Plasmodium parasites that cause malaria, which did lower rates of the disease. So ancient Romans were wrong about what causes malaria, but their solution still helped prevent it. Sometimes public health measures enacted for confused reasons can still have some beneficial effects, thereby also potentially reinforcing one's flawed understanding of cause and effect in disease transmission. Do you understand that I'm foreshadowing flawed modern causal suppositions about respiratory disease spread? But at the end of the day, is miasma real? No. But it is true that this idea dominated for many centuries, and it was what Semmelweis's colleagues believed in the 1850s and what many people continued to believe until damn near the end of the 19th century. So what changed then? What new theory became popular and dissipated the specter of miasma haunting science in Europe? Germ theory. Yes, germ theory. Built on centuries of work from many different people, germ theory finally caught on by the late 1800s, because by this point, it was obvious that it wasn't stinky peasant air that had been making mothers sick in Semmelweis' hospital. It was the corpse germ to pipeline, which seems clear now, but it was a massive paradigm shift. And as proud as doctors were of this new discovery, they were also embarrassed, because only decades earlier their mentors had confidently believed some pretty whack and unintentionally killed loads of people as a result. And so, in their enthusiasm to do a total 180 from that goofy miasma bullshit, influential early 20th century public health figures turned their backs on the idea that diseases could spread through the air over a distance. Like, ever. Now, there were a few scientists who tried to investigate the idea that maybe bacteria could spread through the air, like Karl Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Flügge, a German. At the very end of the 19th century, Flügge and his collaborators were able to culture bacteria on petri dishes placed at distances both near and far from volunteers who talked and sang. This was demonstrated both with volunteers sick with tuberculosis and with healthy volunteers who gargled with a bacteria that turned bright red on the petri dish. This is actually the same stuff that causes pink shower slime. Yuck. Though the bacteria spewed out by these volunteers was more concentrated in the closed petri dishes, it wasn't limited to those, and some bacteria still reached as far as 9 meters away. And the kicker? The researchers also did versions of the experiment where they only placed the petri dishes after the speaker had left the room, and they still cultured bacteria, suggesting that the bacteria remained airborne even after the volunteer left the room. Wow, seems like decent evidence for the possibility of airborne disease spread. But it didn't convince Flügge's contemporaries to consider the possibility that they could apply germ theory to a new, contemporary, evidence-based understanding of airborne disease spread, unfortunately. Instead, in the realm of respiratory infections, that is, those that are going on in the parts we use to breathe, public health figures of the early 20th century focused their energy on preventing infections transmitted from touching infectious particles left behind on surfaces, which they called contact transmission, or people right next to each other spraying bits of quickly falling moisture into each other's mouths, so-called droplet spread. Influential figures promoted the idea of droplet and contact as the drivers of respiratory disease spread, at the expense of dismissing the idea of aerial transmission as of little importance, like this early pioneer of American public health, Charles V. Chapin, not to be confused with the murderer of the same era, Charles E. Chapin. Charles, the public health guy, not the murderer, thought it was silly to suspect that any disease was commonly spread through the air, except, of course, when big fat droplets flew straight out of a sick person's face holes into the face holes of someone right next to them. Chapin thought this droplet spread was the only way to explain infections transmitted between people who get really close to each other but don't actually touch. The idea of touchless transmission happening further than that, though, it basically just wouldn't happen, according to Chapin. His evidence? 1. It's super hard to isolate bacteria in the air using the best technology that 1914 has to offer, so there must be no bacteria in the air. 2. People often fall ill with a respiratory bug after being near a sick person, and literally what else could explain that but fast-falling droplets? There's no reason to consider that there could be even smaller droplets capable of floating through the air, right? Wow, seems airborne. 3. Also, miasma was really embarrassing, and public health leaders wouldn't want to be caught doing something embarrassing now, would they? In all fairness to Chapin, he really wanted people to take precautions against contact transmission, aka he wanted to mainstream the previously disparaged concept of washing your hands, and he thought it would be impossible to promote hand washing as long as people still believed that illness could spread through the air. So, despite the fact that there wasn't actually evidence to back it up, it became public health common sense in the early 20th century that aerial transmission was fake, and droplet and contact explained all respiratory disease transmission. In the last few years, some scientists and historians have started calling this rigid and limited concept of disease transmission the droplet dogma. Dogma because it's not true. Influenza, chickenpox, measles, and COVID have all been proven to be able to transmit through the air, and some scientists hypothesize that all respiratory infections might be airborne to some extent. But because of the many decades of this reality being ignored, scientists have only very recently begun to use advanced technology to study the specifics of airborne disease spread. And current infection control guidelines around the world are based on the outdated idea of droplet transmission, and this ignorance and lack of updated infection control are hurting people now, but it doesn't need to be that way. Okay, now that we've got all that background under our belts, I think that we're finally ready for... So, it's the 1930s, and anyone who's anyone in public health and medicine thinks that droplet and contact transmission accounts for all of the respiratory infections it's worth caring about. But William Wells isn't anyone in public health. He's a sanitary engineer at Harvard with a wartime background in preventing the spread of waterborne diseases, and he thinks something sounds off about droplet transmission because he knows about Stokes' law. Astute observers will note that this doesn't look like medicine, and indeed it is physics. Stokes' law explains why small particles fall slowly through a fluid like water or air. It basically says that the smaller and lighter a particle is, the more that air resistance slows it down from simply falling according to gravity. This is why tiny water droplets in clouds don't just immediately fall as rain. They're so small that air resistance and currents keeps them floating. Wait, floating droplets in clouds? Charles Chapin says that droplets fall to the ground quickly. How could they float? So, an enduring problem is that those in medicine and physics use words differently. From early on in health sciences, people like Chapin used droplet to refer to a blob of liquid big enough that it immediately falls to the ground under gravity. Whereas in physics, a droplet is any bit of liquid which is tiny enough that the air currents pushing it around win out against gravity, so it doesn't just immediately fall, which is like the opposite meaning. Maybe if there had been more knowledge exchange, these clashing terms could have been cleared up, and new understandings in the physics of floating particles could have influenced medicine directly, and this whole mess could have been avoided. But were there a ton of medical professionals inviting physicists to tell them what they might be doing wrong in the 1930s? Or the 2020s? Not really, haha. However, William Wells, the sanitary engineer, actually spent a lot of time talking to a doctor because he was married to one, and her name was Mildred Weeks Wells. They tended to use the classic medical version of droplet as a fast-falling big bit of moisture because of William's previous background in the Army and Mildred's medical experience. However, they did make a huge contribution to the medical vocabulary of infection. But before we get to that, Mildred had done a ton of work combing through epidemiological records of polio transmission, which convinced her that droplet and contact alone couldn't account for the disease's spread, that likely airborne particles were playing a role. William, who had been perplexed and horrified by the incredible spread of the 1918 flu when he worked in army camps, was totally on board with his wife's idea that airborne infection could explain current gaps in understanding, which inspired him to apply his physics knowledge to the issue. Together, they were a pretty brilliant pair, and it was such brilliantly and together that in the 30s and 40s, they experimented and published and established a broad base of airborne transmission knowledge. I'll let them catch you up because they were super productive.
Why, hello everyone. Mildred and William Wells here. Current assumptions in medicine on how bits of moisture move through the air really don't line up with physics. For example, while we know that droplets larger than 1/10 of a millimeter will quickly fall with gravity, any particles smaller than that can float on air currents, as we can derive with Stokes' law. Just so you know, in fancy science terms, we call a tenth of a millimeter 100 microns. A micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Very small stuff. A human hair is only 20 to 200 microns thick. And remember, droplets under 100 microns in size are so small they can float along on air currents. But it's silly to assume that these floaty bits of moisture would remain a constant size because they evaporate as they move through the air, of course. For the very smallest particles of moisture, we can use physics to show that all the water would evaporate almost instantly. However, that doesn't mean the particles just disappear. Many droplets aren't pure water, including the ones that come from our face holes. These contain bits of dissolved substances, like salts and the pathogens that hang out in our bodies. And after all the water is gone, these remnants can float around for a super long time. We've decided to call these leftovers droplet nuclei, but some science folks have started using another snazzy new word to talk about small floating particles: aerosol. We really like this term, and we're going to start using it interchangeably with droplet nuclei. There's probably no way this could ever lead to any confusion.
So, an enduring problem is words.
I wonder what this vision from the future could mean. But in any case, droplet nuclei, aerosols, whatever, should only be a matter of concern if the pathogens riding along in them are able to stay alive in the air long enough to infect someone. And we have determined that bacteria known to cause respiratory illnesses are indeed capable of staying aloft and alive for many hours by sampling the air using our new technology, which is far more advanced than 1914 technology. And we didn't stop there. We've successfully infected animals with floaty droplet nuclei in our labs. And more than that, how sick these cuddly critters get, or indeed if they get sick at all, seems to depend on the dose of germ mist they're exposed to. Why, we've even discovered that we can prevent infection by exposing the disgusting fog to the radiation of ultraviolet light before delivering it to the animals. Hot diggity dog. But we went even further. We had some promising results using the same technology to reduce rates of infectious illness in students at local schools. Finally, in the late 40s, we gathered compelling evidence for one of our favorite pet theories: the idea that tuberculosis can only be spread via aerosols small enough to reach the deepest parts of the lungs, where the bacteria that causes TB takes root. We wanted to prove this because some people think that tuberculosis spreads in dust, even though dust is far too big to reach the lungs. So we refined our aerosol-making machine to make two sizes, smaller or bigger than 5 microns, the size where we estimate that droplet nuclei become too large to reach deep in the lungs. And then we pumped the different-sized aerosols into different rabbit habitats. And wouldn't you know, only the rabbits that got the smaller aerosols got all sick and consumptive. Looks like we were right that only aerosols under 5 microns can cause TB. As proud as we are of all our work, we're concerned about the implications. In crowded indoor spaces, we're likely breathing in each other's nose flora just like we used to drink each other's gut flora before modern water sanitation. Whereas in the US we've gotten dirty water gut pathogens under control, we have yet to manage the spread of the most concerning infectious respiratory diseases, like the flu. This seems like an urgent problem to us. Please, think of the children. All the best, Mildred and William Wells.
The Wells accomplished so much in the 1930s and 40s, from spelling out the basic physics of airborne transmission, like clarifying the maximum size of droplet nuclei capable of floating, 100 microns, to showing that aerosols capable of spreading tuberculosis likely maxed out at 5 microns, because bigger aerosols couldn't reach deep enough in the lungs. But did the Wells' successes convince their contemporaries to take the possibility of airborne infection seriously? No, of course not. They were like, we don't care about your droplet nuclei machine because it's not like humans are machines for creating aerosols. And also we don't care about your rabbits because they're not people. And that experiment with those school kids that one time, we tried to replicate your UV protection thing like twice and it didn't work great. So airborne transmission isn't real. Case closed. Alexander Langmuir, first and longtime head epidemiologist at the CDC, Chopin fanboy, and #1 hater of airborne transmission who led Team Droplet Dogma in the mid-20th century. Langmuir thought that some of his own experiments proved that droplet transmission was the main driver of respiratory infections, and that airborne transmission was fake. The mistakes that he made with these experiments would be repeated by others up until the present, which is why we need to understand them. Basically, Langmuir thought he could reduce rates of respiratory disease by changing the sleeping arrangements of some soldiers at Fort Bragg to be bunk beds like this instead of a dense single row at floor level, so that every soldier had more distance between himself and the others, even though there was still the same number of people in each room. If, according to Langmuir, droplets were the main driver of transmission, the new arrangements would reduce illness because most of the droplets would quickly fall to the ground before they got in anyone's face holes. Whereas, if the Welses were right and pathogens could float through the air, spacing the soldiers further apart wouldn't change the rates because the volume of air and the number of dudes in the room remained the same. And the rates of respiratory infections in the bunk bed barracks did drop compared to the cramped barracks. So Langmuir concluded that respiratory infections spread through close contact, meaning droplet spread was definitely happening and airborne was a fantasy. However, his conclusion didn't actually make sense. Can you spot his error? Here are some hints. 1. The Welses noticed early on that the amount of infectious droplet nuclei an animal was exposed to seemed to affect how sick it got, or if it got sick at all. 2. Even earlier than that, Flüge and friends noticed that the amount of red bacteria captured on the petri dishes decreased with distance from the speaker. So, if exhaled aerosols get less concentrated as they move away from someone's face, and whether a person gets sick depends on their dose of infectious aerosols, then the results of Langmuir's bunk experiment could still be explained with an airborne model because obviously the risk of airborne infection is higher the closer someone is to the infected person. So Langmuir didn't actually prove that droplet was real and airborne was fake. All he showed was that spacing people apart reduced infection risk. Even though his results didn't actually imply anything about how the infections were spreading, Langmuir chose to interpret the outcome in a way that confirmed his pre-existing beliefs. Just like when ancient Romans concluded that miasma was real because draining swamps reduced malaria. It seems like an obvious logical error when we spell it out today, but back then Langmuir was sticking to his guns even though he was wrong, which he eventually admitted. In 1987, long after he had retired, Langmuir wrote, "In the 1930s, William Firth Wells argued with intensity that measles was primarily an airborne infection. We should have given him more attention and respect." So what happened between 1951 and 1987 to change Langmuir's mind on airborne infection? So, it's the early 1950s, and anyone who's anyone in public health and medicine thinks that droplet and contact transmission account for most of the respiratory infections it's worth caring about. Still, the Welses are several decades older and somewhat worse for the wear. Mildred's further experiments with placing UV in public places have failed to make an impact because the haters aren't willing to examine her results with an open mind, and she has, unfortunately, retired from science. So, William is pushing on without her, working with a few close collaborators, including the Riley brothers, who are going to be important later on after the Welses are gone, which is actually not too long from now. But William made his final act the big one. He was going to prove beyond a doubt that tuberculosis was airborne, even if he died trying. Which he did, actually. After years of wrangling permission, William finally set up the ultimate TB experiment in Loch Raven Veterans Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Picture this. Tuberculosis ward at the hospital. Men, tuberculosis come in, but the air doesn't get out except through the specific vents that are sucking it out of the ward and into the specially designed guinea pig habitats in the attic. If tuberculosis is spread in big droplets that can't float, obviously the guinea pigs shouldn't get tuberculosis, but because tuberculosis is airborne, the guinea pigs get infected from the aerosols that the sick humans are breathing out. And for the haters who thought that maybe the woman who is actually conducting the experiments, Creedle Mills, is accidentally giving the guinea pigs TB herself when she cares for them, there's even a second group of KVs in a separate enclosure that has their tuberculosis air treated with ultraviolet radiation before it reaches them. And surprise! The UV guinea pigs don't get TB because the radiation kills the bacteria in the droplet nuclei. And thus, finally, it was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that tuberculosis is naturally airborne in this landmark experiment, which was published in 1962. This obviously led public health institutions to revisit the droplet dogma, allowing William a moment of triumph before his death in 1963, 5 years after the departure of his beloved wife, Mildred. Right? No, of course not. In 1964, Langmuir, still chief epidemiologist of the CDC, publishes an essay about airborne spread where he's like, well, I'll give it to that Wells guy. He really did prove that tuberculosis is exclusively airborne, that dead bastard. It's all got something to do with those tiny particles under 5 microns, those aerosols. But for the other things like measles and the flu, it's impossible to know. But it's probably droplets. But I know we're all itching to get to the new millennium. History is cool, but what does it have to do with me? All right, I guess we can speed run our way through to Langmuir's 1980s admission that he messed up all the way through Y2K because things get thorny in the 2000s. 1966. Alexander Langmuir predicts that with the advent of new vaccines, measles could be eradicated in the US in 1967. 1968. Measles has not been eradicated, though the number of cases has dropped dramatically thanks to the vaccines. 1970. Alexander Langmuir retires from the CDC. 1971, measles cases start to rise again. Langmuir is probably scratching his head on a beach somewhere. Two brothers who collaborated with the Wells when they were younger, Ed and Richard Riley, think the rise in measles might have to do with airborne spread not being considered. So over the next few years, they use the exciting new technology of computer to create a model for indoor airborne disease spread that takes into account ventilation systems, where the first infectious person was located, how many people in the area are already vaccinated, and much more. They plug in all of the initial conditions for a real 1974 school measles outbreak into the model, and it reproduces the same outbreak that actually happened by exclusively considering airborne spread. The brothers call this model the Wells-Riley model. Wow, it looks like measles is airborne. Who could have predicted this?
Mildred and William Wells here.
1978. After an initial rejection from the American Journal of Epidemiology for not being significant enough, the Riley brothers' paper detailing the success of the Wells-Riley model in their investigation of a local outbreak is published, providing compelling evidence that measles can and does spread through the air. 1980, Alexander Langmuir admits in an essay that his prediction that measles would soon be eradicated in the US was an egregious blunder, and that one of the reasons he totally missed the mark was that he didn't recognize that measles is clearly airborne. He ends his essay saying that epidemiologists of the future should clearly practice their profession with a greater humility and skepticism of their past teachings than he did. Does this happen? Does the recognition of measles as sometimes definitely airborne finally trigger a reckoning in airborne science? Are technologies and techniques to prevent airborne transmission finally researched and refined? I already told you, no. There's just basically a very conditional recognition that some pathogens like tuberculosis and measles can spread through the air, but there's no sea change where epidemiologists are scrambling to test their former assumptions about respiratory disease spread. What does spread amongst the public health girlies in the final decades of the 20th century are some facts about respiratory aerosols that are not actually facts. Let's investigate. In the context of the AIDS epidemic that began in the early 1980s, cases of tuberculosis were rising in the United States in a way they hadn't since effective treatments for TB became widely available in the global north, because people with compromised immune systems are much more vulnerable to TB. So, by the late 80s, public health people in wealthy countries are thinking way more about tuberculosis than they have in a long time, which means they're also thinking a lot more about airborne spread because they are at least willing to admit by now that TB is definitely airborne, but they don't get everything right.
Airborne spread requires infectious particles in the form of droplet nuclei. These particles are between 0.5 to 5 microns and can stay suspended in the air for long periods of time.
So I don't think the Welleses said that droplet nuclei or exhaled aerosols were limited to 5 microns in size.
Droplet nuclei are so small, 1 to 5 microns, that air currents normally present in any indoor space can keep them airborne for long periods of time. Although patients with tuberculosis also generate larger particles, these particles do not remain airborne.
False.
Tuberculosis is carried in airborne particles known as droplet nuclei. The particles are so small, 1 to 5 microns, that normal air currents keep them airborne.
Okay, So, the next quotes we're going to check out aren't even from TB documents specifically. They are from more general infection control guidance from the 80s and 90s.
Airborne transmission occurs by dissemination of airborne droplet nuclei, small particle residue 5 microns or smaller in size, that remain suspended in the air for long periods of time. Airborne or aerosol transmission occurs when microorganisms are contained in droplet nuclei of a size 5 to 10 microns. Large droplets, 10 microns in diameter or larger, generally fall to the ground within 1 meter of the patient.
Hold on, that's just not right at all. And also, the second one is from 2013. It looks like this mistake really snowballed. What the is going on? So, by the end of the 20th century, it is very well documented that people in public health believed that aerosols are exhaled particles under 5 microns in size, and that being this small is what allows them to float because anything bigger would quickly fall. While it is true that a 5 micron particle can float in the air for a long time, it is not true that droplets larger than 5 microns would quickly fall to the ground. Anyone studying pollution or meteorology could quickly call on this idea, and you should be able to as well, because you know that the Welleses learned that particles up to 100 microns in size were able to float rather than falling immediately. And 100 is like 1 to 20 times bigger than 5. So where was this misunderstanding coming from? Well, actually, it was probably coming from the Welleses, or rather from misinterpretations of their work. These origins of the so-called 5 micron error were only recently traced, and as far as anyone can tell, it goes all the way back to the Welleses' work with tuberculosis, in which they determined that only particles under 5 microns were able to spread TB. This idea was picked up on by Langmuir, who only recognized that tuberculosis was airborne after the Welleses had kicked the bucket.
Well, I'll give it to that Wells guy. It's all got something to do with those
those tiny particles under 5 microns, those aerosols. And this misunderstanding spiraled out of control. The Welleses were only ever pointing out that aerosols larger than 5 microns definitely couldn't make it into the deepest part of the lungs, not that these particles couldn't float at all, or that they couldn't spread other pathogens, because tuberculosis is special. Most respiratory pathogens don't need to reach the deepest part of the lungs to make you sick. But the droplet dogma was just so entrenched that when Langmuir, at the height of his influence, highlighted a 5 micron cutoff in his first writings admitting that airborne spread happened at all, people were like, yeah, okay, sure, 5 microns makes it airborne, maybe aerosol equals 5 microns, nothing else, usually airborne, got it. If there had been widespread investigation into the specifics of airborne disease spread in the 80s and 90s, maybe someone would have picked up on this huge physics mistake being passed around until it was accepted as fact, but that just didn't happen. So public health was heading into the 21st century in a bad state re-airborne transmission. We had very limited recognition that airborne transmission sometimes occurs with some pathogens, but overall a lack of curiosity to investigate further. A really embarrassing fundamental physics error claiming that aerosols are particles under 5 or 10 microns in size, and that larger particles can't remain airborne. The continued logical error that disease transmission between close people who don't touch can only be explained by droplet spread. Improved protective, this one isn't actually bad. There is improved protective equipment against aerosol transmission available and recommended for healthcare workers in the form of N95 masks to prevent tuberculosis in healthcare settings. These were invented in the early 90s and were rapidly rolled out into production and officially recommended by NIOSH in 1995. Wow, this is a zine, super 90s. So that's like one thing about airborne spread that doesn't totally suck in 1999. I wonder what will happen next. What challenges will public health soon face in the new millennium? Do you know? March 12th, 2003. Unlike previous eras of our history, I am alive. The toy of the year is the Beyblade, and the World Health Organization announces the spread of a severe pneumonia of unknown origin in Southeast Asia, soon to be named SARS, for severe acute respiratory syndrome. This episode fits so neatly into this history. There's an infuriating pattern of assumptions being taken as fact and leads about potential airborne transmission being ignored by major public health institutions. We're gonna dive in to show that these embarrassing fundamental mistakes continued to pile up when the new millennium rolled in a way that set the stage for devastating future failure. So anyways, severe acute respiratory syndrome. I wonder if it's airborne. Let's investigate. First emerging in November 2002 in Guangdong province in southeastern China, the spread of this mystery illness is facilitated by people traveling for Lunar New Year celebrations. One doctor from the province carries this mysterious ailment to the Hotel Metropole in Hong Kong, where he somehow manages to infect 17 other travelers who continue to spread the illness in the region and beyond. Notable outbreaks in Hong Kong include Ward 8A of the Prince of Wales Hospital, where one sick patient who had picked up his mysterious infection at the Hotel Metropole manages to infect 138 other people, including one who brings the illness back to the Amoy Gardens housing complex, where 329 other residents are ultimately infected with what is confirmed later in March to be a novel or new virus, specifically a coronavirus, a class of viruses which up until this point had not been considered much of a threat. This one is dubbed SARS-CoV, and its transmission is considered something of a mystery, a matter of debate, if you will, amongst public health professionals at the time, who note that some people don't seem to spread the virus to anyone else, while others seem to be super spreaders, like the patient in Ward 8A. A theory quickly emerges to explain the explosive spread of SARS in some healthcare settings, namely that the virus is being opportunistically aerosolized in aerosol generating procedures. And what does that even mean? So an aerosol generating procedure is one of a number of medical procedures which involves some kind of tube or something going in your air holes and riling everything up. The idea behind the proposed connection between AGPs and the spread of SARS is that AGPs would cause particles of respiratory fluid which would normally fall to the ground in big droplets to become airborne. And if you're suspecting that this idea doesn't actually add up, you're onto something. Let's look closer.
Novel virus special investigator.
So, as I mentioned, one of the most significant SARS outbreaks, which was initially blamed on AGPs, happened at the Prince of Wales Hospital, which led to one patient bringing SARS back to the Amoy Gardens housing complex, which looks like this. It's a group of 19 high-rise towers housing each around 1,000 people, 329 of whom came down with SARS in spring 2003, 42 of whom died. How did this happen? The SARS outbreak in Amoy Gardens began and was centered in, but not limited to, the E-block building, where the first, or index patient, was staying with family. This outbreak was a huge deal that eventually involved evacuating the entire E-block. So local authorities really wanted to understand how this virus was spreading between people in this huge complex, which is how Professor Yuguo Li, an expert in indoor air currents and distinguished professor at the University of Hong Kong Mechanical Engineering Department, first got involved. Li was immediately struck by the design of the buildings, which involves these interior light shafts, which he recognized were probably acting as chimneys, where air, warmed by the daytime heat, would shoot up to the top of the building, passing by and entering the open windows of many apartments as it reached for the sky. He suspected this might have something to do with the Amoy Gardens outbreak, which is why he disagreed with the initial official result of the local authorities' investigation into the outbreak, which was sort of a nonsensical Rube Goldberg chain of droplet and contact spread that started with the index patient's diarrhea and a faulty floor drain and kind of stopped making sense from there. The official investigation doesn't do a great job of explaining how the outbreak made it out of Block E and into the other buildings in the complex. So Professor Li is not impressed and will do his own investigation later. But first, after the initial Amoy Gardens investigation is concluded, Professor Li is actually invited to investigate the outbreak in Prince of Wales Hospital, Ward 8A, where the guy who brought SARS to Amoy Gardens first caught it. Because things there are already not lining up from a droplet and contact perspective in the investigation of this outbreak, in which 138 people were infected by the index case over 15 days. Professor Li has never been asked to solve a problem quite like this before, and in combing through the literature looking for guidance, he actually comes upon a book from the 1950s that really winds up influencing his investigations, a book by William Wells, as well as the Wells-Riley model from the 1970s, because that was still the most recent comprehensive work on the topic of airborne transmission many decades later. But more modern research wasn't actually necessary for Professor Li to realize that something was fishy about the AGP explanation. For example, there were nearly 70 medical students who visited the ward where the index patient stayed, and students who visited when the patient was undergoing an aerosol generating procedure were no more likely to fall ill with SARS than students who visited at other times, which doesn't support the theory that AGPs were to blame for super spreading events in healthcare settings. However, it did seem like there was an association with how close a student got to the index patient and whether they also got SARS. But it wasn't only students who got within a meter of the index patient who got sick, and a meter was the defined limit for droplet spread. Also, patients in other cubicles completely across the ward also got infected with SARS, and that is far beyond the reach of droplets. So for it to be spreading that much through contact, you would have to assume that this is like the worst hospital ever with no hand washing or surface disinfection, which it wasn't. So Professor Lee decides to use the exciting, new-ish technology of computer to simulate the complex airflows in Ward 8A. They do a study letting a harmless gas move through the ward to measure how air actually moves around in there. They get detailed information about the air conditioning system and the temperatures on the days of the outbreak, and they put it all in the computer to do a supercharged version of what the Rileys did in the 1970s. And wouldn't you know, the way the air currents move around from the index patient's bed to the rest of the ward matches up really well with who actually got sick and when. Like, oh, okay, these patients catty corner down here from the index. Computer can model that the existing air currents in the ward would have driven a concentrated stream of air from the index patient's bed to these people. Because while it's true that respiratory aerosols become more diffuse the further they move from a source, they don't just perfectly dilute so that there's an even concentration throughout an entire space. Because air doesn't work like that. It's dynamic. Hot air rising in one place and cool air sinking in another, or getting pushed or pulled by a fan, all of which means it's possible for a relatively concentrated dose of infectious aerosols to reach one spot while another corner never gets any infectious particles. And this is the most comprehensive explanation we have for the spread of SARS in Ward 8A, that in the course of his normal breathing, coughing, and occasional nebulizer treatments, the index patient released infectious aerosols into the air, which were most concentrated in his own corner, where the most people got infected, but that were also pushed by air currents across the ward to other nooks and crannies where they infected patients and healthcare workers alike. Wow, seems airborne. And Professor Lee's work didn't stop in Ward 8A. He went back to Amoy Gardens and did more investigating and modeling, and realized that the explanation that made the most sense in that outbreak was not the nonsense from the early official investigation. What made the most sense when wind and weather conditions at the time were modeled and considered was that the index patient's viral material from fecal matter made it into the faulty floor drain of his own bathroom, and that his own bathroom exhaust fan then pulled that nasty liquid into tiny floaty aerosols in the light shaft, which connected all of the apartments from bottom to top, where the warming shit mist gently rose, some of it entering the open windows of higher apartments and being inhaled by humans before it reached the sky, and some of the rest of it traveling in precisely aimed, unlucky air currents that took the mist to the open windows of other buildings. Disgusting but thorough work from Professor Lee. And you know what? This research became the accepted explanation for the spread of SARS at Amoy Gardens. The world of public health was like, yeah, actually, that totally makes the most sense here. Professor Lee's work in Amoy Gardens was universally acknowledged as the best explanation for the Amoy Gardens outbreak by the time retrospective papers on the SARS epidemic were being written in 2006. And Professor Lee's other work in Ward 8A, where he used similar methods to show that the exhaled aerosols from normal breathing and coughing floating through the air was enough to spread SARS there, did that work also change the way that public health institutions looked back on that outbreak? Well, we'll get back to that, because first we need to trace the journeys of two more travelers from the Hotel Metropole.
A Tale of Two Cities.
It was the best of times. It was the SARST of times. Sorry. Two Canadian visitors to Hong Kong brought back SARS to their respective cities of Toronto, Ontario, and Vancouver, British Columbia, with wildly different outcomes. You see, in Vancouver, according to the WHO themselves, a combination of robust worker safety and infection control culture at Vancouver General, with better systemic preparedness, ensured that BC was spared the devastation that befell Ontario. Wait, what? An epidemic tale that doesn't end in avoidable but predictable devastation? Yup. The Regional Worker Safety Organization in BC designated the precautionary principle as their preferred approach. This basically amounts to prioritizing the practice of better safe than sorry, like using airborne precautions in the face of a new threat and making sure healthcare workers are already trained and prepared to use N95s, those new masks that rolled out in the early 90s to protect healthcare healthcare workers from tuberculosis. As a result, the index patient in Vancouver didn't spread the illness to anyone else, and an outbreak was successfully avoided. But this was not the case in Toronto. The Toronto index patient was written off by her doctors when she first sought medical attention, enabling her to spread the virus to her family members before she died at home. Her son eventually infected many others at the Scarborough Grace Hospital, setting off an outbreak that would infect at least 300 people in Ontario and claim the lives of 44, leading the World Health Organization to issue an advisory against travel to Toronto, which made the local government super mad because tourism. People need to see the Hockey Hall of Fame. Toronto actually prematurely declared their SARS outbreak totally over and relaxed the measures to watch out for new infections, which led to SARS regaining ground and infecting more people. Sound familiar? By the way, I learned about SARS in Canada from the award-winning podcast Public Health is Dead. You should really check them out to get the full story. So obviously, with these two cases to compare, where one city taking airborne precautions prevented an outbreak and another had a bunch of people die, along with Professor Lee's work in Ward 8A, influential people in public health were definitely suspecting that this disease could maybe be airborne beyond AGPs, right? No, of course not. The World Health Organization just didn't read Professor Lee's work on Ward 8A, I guess, because by the time that epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists like Canada's John Conley were retrospecting on the SARS epidemic a safe few years after it had been declared over in July 2003, the official party line was, as we can read in the World Health Organization's dramatically titled 2006 report, SARS, How an Epidemic Was Stopped.
The main mode of transmission of SARS is through respiratory droplets that require close contact or transfer through fomites.
By the way, a fomite refers to a surface with infectious particles on it, aka the contact in droplet and contact transmission. Okay, now back to the WHO's report about SARS.
Under special circumstances, aerosolization can occur, leading to airborne spread.
By special circumstances, they are referring to AGPs and one crazy case of poop mist in Hong Kong. And the WHO report does literally cite Professor Lee's investigation of the spread of SARS in Amoy Gardens 3 times. That study was published in 2004, and the WHO also cites an additional 2004 study from Professor Lee. But his other 2004 paper, where he makes a case for aerosol spread of SARS via normal breathing in Ward 8A, WHO just didn't care to look at that one, I guess. But Lola, you might be saying, the report is called SARS, How an Epidemic Was Stopped. If public health institutions were selectively ignoring evidence to suit their own learned biases, how did they successfully contain the virus then? Well, I would say they got lucky. The eventual approach to SARS containment was identifying people who could potentially be sick with SARS based on their symptoms and isolating them before they could infect anyone. And this worked because people who were sick with SARS were most infectious after they had already been sick for a few days with a strange unseasonal pneumonia, which left enough time for those people to be identified and isolated before they could spread the infection. There were also essentially no asymptomatic cases of SARS. There were no people who seemed well but were actually transmitting the virus to others, which is possible with other illnesses. Because if that had been happening, or if people had been most infectious before they started showing symptoms, the strategy that the public health minds of the world used to combat SARS would not have worked. But none of the movers and shakers in public health were aware of that at the time, and few people were paying enough attention to poor Professor Lee's work in Ward 8A. They were all just patting themselves on the back about the droplets and the aerosol generating procedures. Except, spoiler, guess what, everyone? Lots of supposed AGPs produce about the same amount of aerosols as normal breathing. And regular old coughing actually produces orders of magnitude more aerosols than many AGPs. The idea that AGPs are a big concern for airborne transmission, but regular breathing and talking are not an infection risk is an outdated concept based on very poor evidence. But wait, who actually did the work to figure out how many aerosols we do produce when we breathe and cough and talk? I said that few people were paying attention to Professor Lee's work in Ward 8A, not that no one was. It's time to meet some more friends. In spring 2003, Lidia Morawska, a Polish-Australian physicist who specializes in microscopic airborne pollution and current Australian Laureate Fellow at the Queensland University of Technology, was invited by the World Health Organization to investigate the explosive SARS outbreak at Amoy Gardens. And then they canceled their investigation and disinvited her a few months later because SARS was subsiding and probably it was just droplets or something, and who cares? Or wait, sorry, the WHO didn't care. But Professor Morawska doesn't lose interest. She's intrigued by the issue of potential airborne transmission, so she dives into the literature to see what work already exists, which is how she finds out that nearly nothing has been done since some guy called Wells in like the 1940s, and she thinks this is ridiculous. So in 2006, she publishes this honestly banger scientific manifesto that's like, hey, airborne infection is a super understudied problem that we clearly need to tackle to prevent sickness and improve human health and also save some of the money lost due to preventable illness. It's embarrassing that we can't say any more about how pathogens spread through the air than what people figured out 70 years ago. Let's fix that. Thus begins the new era of high-tech investigation of respiratory aerosols, in which researchers start to make up for lost time. Professor Morawska designs this wacky mini wind tunnel that people can stick their heads into that can measure and count exhaled particles. And with this system, her team starts to fill in so many gaps in the knowledge. Modern breathing cone studies have revealed that 1. Lots of floaty respiratory aerosols are produced during all respiratory activities. That's breathing, singing, talking, coughing, etc. 2, there are modes of particle size. That means that people don't just create one size of respiratory particles or an even distribution of particles along a range, but that the particles that come out of our wet face holes cluster around certain different sizes. 3, these different modes of particle size correspond to different physical processes of creation in different locations in our body. Like, for example, normal breathing creates a super huge quantity of teeny particles under 1 micron in size, which are made deep in the lungs. Whereas when people talk or cough, additional larger modes emerge from particles that are created in our voice boxes and our mouths. Coughing actually produces the most particles of any activity among all size modes. Even though the numerical majority of the particles generated are under 1 micron, these were never identified by earlier researchers like the Wellses because the technology to detect such particles simply didn't exist in the 1940s.
Hey, if most particles produced are under 1 micron, maybe the 5 micron rule wasn't so stupid after all.
Oh, hello, ghost of public health past. It's nice to see you in the, flesh. I didn't actually say there are no size modes over 5 microns. There totally are. The data as of 2009 was very preliminary, and those early systems had some limitations in their ability to measure larger particles and, okay, There's more about modern airborne science than what I can cover in the rest of this video and still tell the remaining history. So if y'all want me to, I'll explain it more in depth in the future for those who like diagrams and graphs. Suffice to say that by the 2010s, it is definitively proven that people produce loads of floaty aerosols in a whole range of sizes when they talk, cough, or even breathe normally.
Yeah, okay, but just because people are making lots of floaty particles doesn't mean we know that those have viruses in them.
Well, actually, Ghost of Public Health past, Lydia Moravska wasn't the only scientist inspired from afar by the SARS epidemic to dig deeper into the world of airborne pathogen transmission. Dr. Donald Milton is a medical doctor and distinguished professor of environmental health at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, who started his career investigating lung diseases that plague factory workers. And like Professor Moravska, he is inspired by the SARS epidemic to call for a major reinvigoration in the study of airborne pathogen transmission. In an influential 2004 essay, Dr. Milton proposes updating the way we think about airborne transmission to be less yes or no and more a spectrum. From exclusively airborne to mostly airborne to sometimes airborne under weird circumstances to not at all airborne. At this point in 2004, Dr. Milton says that SARS is definitely sometimes airborne in weird circumstances like Amoy Gardens, and that he can't eliminate the possibility that it might be mostly airborne, which checks out because at this point, Professor Lee's work from Ward 8A hadn't been published yet. But Dr. Milton didn't stop his work on airborne transmission with this essay. He actually thought, wow, somebody should totally try to prove that viruses actually exist in the particles that people exhale. And so, like Professor Moravska, Dr. Milton built a funny little breeding cone. Dr. Milton's machine is a bit different though. His sorts respiratory particles into two size groups and collects these into vials, which can then be tested for viral genetic material, which the researchers absolutely find loads of when they get volunteers with the flu to spend some quality time in the cone. Great work, Professors Milton and Moravska. Thanks to them, at this point in the 2010s, it's finally proven that people exhale lots of floaty particles and that these can and do carry viruses.
Hold on, just because the particles have viruses in them doesn't mean those viruses were proven to be actually infectious.
Thank you, Ghost. The short answer to this objection is, I get where you're coming from, but your objection is invalid because there have been studies where researchers were able to successfully prove that captured aerosols had live infectious viruses in them by using viruses captured from the air to infect new cells, aka testing if they are viable. But the long answer is that yes, researchers are not always able to infect cells with viruses that they capture from the air. However, this doesn't mean that those viruses are definitely never viable in the air, or even that they weren't viable in the studies that failed to infect new cells. It just means that this is a totally new science where people are still figuring out some of the fundamentals of how to do the research. It's actually really hard to culture viruses in general, and the best practices to culture viruses from the air are far from settled. Rejecting the possibility of airborne spread because a study didn't capture viable viruses makes as much sense as when Charles Chapin said that his inability to isolate bacteria from the air with 1914 technology meant that there were no bacteria in the air at all. Not very good scientific reasoning. So, pardon the interruption. At this point in the 2010s, it's been shown that people exhale lots of floaty particles and that these can and do carry viruses. So you'd think that public health organizations and infectious disease doctors would be starting to pay attention, right? Let's find out by checking a major review from 2013. A review is a big paper where researchers gather all of the literature on a topic and write a big summary on the current state of knowledge. One of the authors on this one is John Conley, the Canadian infectious disease specialist who had concluded in 2006 that SARS was definitely not airborne. Let's see what his team had to say in this era of exciting scientific advances. Ghost, the book, please.
It had been assumed in the past that the airborne route of transmission was important. Research over the years has provided evidence that this is not the case. Airborne or aerosol transmission occurs when microorganisms are contained in droplet nuclei of a size 5 to 10 microns. Large droplets, 10 microns in diameter or larger, generally fall to the ground within 1 meter of the patient.
Oh no. So, all of that had been pretty definitively disproven with Professor Moravska's work 5 years earlier. I sure hope that public health institutions don't come to this guy for guidance in the future. Crack team included John Conley. The report was also created in consultation with John Conley. Unfortunately, even during this 2010s renaissance of airborne disease science, the researchers involved could not get mainstream public health to listen to them. The droplet dogma was just too strong, and this put everyone in a poor position to handle threats that were just around the corner in the next decade. So, a lot has happened in the last few years that's relevant to this history, huh? Are you starting to understand why I really wanted to make this video? Let's review the events of recent years. On January 5th, 2020, the World Health Organization makes an announcement that an atypical pneumonia is spreading in Wuhan, China. But not to fear, the WHO knows how it spreads.
This is airborne. Corona is airborne.
Wait, what?
Sorry, I use the military word airborne. It meant to spread via droplets.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about more right for them. Spoiler, there's no special military meaning of airborne. No one knows what Tedros Ghebreyesus, the director of the World Health Organization, actually meant when he said that. Then, a few weeks after that confusing statement, the WHO released some written guidance. Ghost of Public Health Past. Can you read these?
I'm not the ghost of public health past. They're gone. I'm the ghost of public health present.
But you've been standing there the whole time and you look exactly like the ghost of Public Health Past.
Oh no, that's a very common mistake. I'm modern. Now, what did you want me to read?
This here, the WHO excerpts from February 23rd and 28th.
COVID-19 is transmitted via droplets and fomites during close, unprotected contact. Airborne spread has not been reported for COVID-19 and it is not believed to be a major driver of transmission. However, it can be envisaged if certain aerosol-generating procedures are conducted. Respiratory droplets land on objects and surfaces around the person with COVID-19. This is why it is important to stay more than 1 meter or 3 feet away from a person who is sick.
Sorry, could I also get some March 27th?
Respiratory droplets are particles, which are greater than 5 to 10 microns in diameter.
Thanks, Ghost. So, seeing that the WHO was prematurely declaring that COVID-19 spread via droplets based solely on observations of people in close contact infecting each other, and repeating the 5 micron error and also rehashing that nonsense about AGPs was very worrying and frustrating for our friends like Professors Lee and Moravska and Milton and a whole bunch of their colleagues. And if you were wondering, who was guiding these whack messages that the WHO was sending to the public? Behind the scenes in early 2020, the WHO gathered a crack team of experts to tackle the crisis. The Infection Prevention and Control Research and Development Expert Group for COVID-19, or the IPCRDEGC19. I'm not saying that again, I'm calling them crack team from here on out. In the beginning, crack team included none of the scientists who had been rapidly advancing the study of airborne transmission in the last decade. It consisted Instead, mostly of droplet infection prevention people like John Conley, the Canadian doctor who kept being wrong about SARS. Sure, why not? In response to this worrying messaging from the world's foremost public health institution, the airborne scientists start to organize to get out the message that ignoring the potential of airborne spread is dangerous, published in academic journals. But in those first few months, they face total rejection from top scientific journals. All the while, epidemiological evidence is piling up that makes airborne spread look very likely. Like SARS-CoV-2 RNA being found in air samples of hospital rooms of patients who are not undergoing AGPs or who are asymptomatic, and increasing evidence of wide-scale asymptomatic spread. In fact, it becomes clear that asymptomatic people are driving a lot of the transmission through well-documented and studied superspreader cases like one Mr. X, who, while having no symptoms and not talking to anybody, manages to infect 10 fellow bus riders in January 2020, which, if someone spreads a respiratory illness in a poorly ventilated bus without coughing or talking, only by breathing normally and being quiet, or if a single asymptomatic choir member singing at a socially distanced meetup manages to infect 53 out of 61 of their fellow singers in one evening, and then scientists painstakingly reconstruct the event, confirming that basically no one was ever close enough for droplets to spread the virus. And then they use the Wells-Riley model to confirm that the event lines up best with the airborne hypothesis. If Italy, the first epicenter of COVID-19 outside of China, is completely devastated with loads of healthcare workers getting infected despite the fact that facilities are following droplet precautions, these are all strong indicators that airborne spread is probably happening and that measures need to be taken to prevent it. However, that doesn't happen. What does happen is that on March 28th, the World Health Organization tweets,
Fact, COVID-19 is not airborne.
and they never retracted this statement. If you're looking for spoilers as to whether the WHO eventually admits that SARS-CoV-2 spreads through the air on floaty aerosols, roll it forward.
In December 2021, the WHO updates their website to admit that aerosol transmission does sometimes happen.
But it took until the end of 2021 for them to say that very quietly. And there has never been a campaign to inform the public or even doctors about this update, which directly contradicts the WHO's previous, far more public statement, which on some levels is not surprising considering how embarrassing the rest of the story is. Yes, there's more. I'm sorry. After that wacko tweet goes out, Professor Moravska brings together a group of 36 experts from many different fields that study elements of airborne transmission, including Hugo Ali and Donald Milton and so many other awesome researchers. And in a day, they get together a letter that explains their urgent concerns and send it to the top brass at WHO on April 1st, 2020. RIP. Within 2 days, this Group 36 is on a Zoom call with WHO leadership and crack team. And Group 36 tries to explain the amazing advances in airborne science they've made in the last few years and how all that connects to COVID-19. And in response, in the recollections of Group 36 member Professor Jose Luis Jimenez from UC Boulder, John Conley yells at Lidia Moravska,
Where is your evidence? Where is your evidence?
This Zoom call ends in a bit of a stalemate. A leisurely 2 weeks after Group 36's initial call with the World Health Organization on April 16th, 2020, the WHO emails their formal response to Group 36, and this response is incredible. Every logical error that I've already explained to you, every bit of confusion on the 5 micron limit, and bad conclusions about aerosol generating procedures, all of that is in this response from the World Health Organization to the scientists who are desperately trying to get them to wake up and take a precautionary approach to saving lives. And to be clear, nobody from that WHO response would try to repeat the claims in that letter today. They know now that they were wrong. In fact, in November 2022, the exiting chief scientist of the WHO said that not recognizing airborne spread earlier was their greatest mistake. But sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me check my timeline. Oh, yeah, I had to make a huge timeline of events and publications to make sense of all of this. It is also linked in the description below if you're curious. Okay, so back to the story. In mid-April, Group 36 gets the terrible email from the WHO, and they're like, screw this, we're going public. The scientists quickly find hundreds more of their expert colleagues who are willing to sign on to an open letter. The initial group of 36 becoming 241. And they submit their urgent warning about airborne spread to top science journals. And then obviously, the most prestigious journals reject their open letter. On May 28th, on June 17th, actually, one of the reasons supplied to Group 241 for the rejection is that the case counts in late spring 2020 seem to be dropping already without airborne measures, providing assurance that it's definitely droplet in contact. Embarrassing for whoever wrote that one, huh? Finally, 3 months after the original petition to the WHO on July 6th, at which point 500,000 people are confirmed dead of COVID-19, the experts' open letter is published in the Oxford journal Clinical Infectious Diseases, accompanied by major news articles. The next day, the WHO holds a press conference where they admit that airborne spread is maybe possible. They release a brief 2 days later clarifying their position where they say, more or less,
We're definitely not certain about the airborne thing, unlike droplet spread, which we're very certain about. Also, we don't recommend that healthcare workers wear N95s or similar respirators, the kind of mask appropriate for airborne diseases, unless they're doing AGPs.
And this back and forth where there's tiny shreds of official recognition, where the airborne experts are throwing reams of evidence at public health institutions saying, hey, look, this thing is probably predominantly airborne, and that's why we haven't stopped it yet. But there are ways we can prevent transmission more effectively by improving air quality in public places through ventilation and filtration and UV light. And also probably you should recommend high quality respirators in the meantime, because these new vaccinations might not be enough to stop the spread of the virus. And then the institutions really quietly change a bit of language on their website without updating the public, and it's all just a little too late and nothing really gets done to make things better. That is how the last 5 years have been and continue to be. Okay, it took until December 2021, at which point tons more research had been published to support the idea that SARS-CoV-2 was airborne. Even the editors of Nature, arguably the most prestigious science journal in the world, published an editorial in February 2021 like, hey, wow, this virus looks super airborne and the current guidance from major public health institutions is inadequate and confusing. After all of this and more comes out, the WHO finally in December 2021 quietly updates their website to admit that aerosol transmission does sometimes happen, and that in terms of their recommendations for healthcare workers, they say that a high-quality respirator should be worn by healthcare workers before entering the room of someone with suspected or confirmed COVID-19.
Based on health workers' values and preferences, and on their perception of what offers the highest protection possible to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection.
What? Can you imagine OSHA being like,
respirators should be worn by coal miners based on coal miners' values and preferences, and on their perception of what offers the highest protection possible to prevent inhaling coal dust?
Or wait, probably they might actually do that now. Things are pretty bleak. But with airborne spread, that total nonsense was 4 years ago. Surely things are at least a little bit better now, and public health institutions have finally taken up the challenge put forth by the Welleses in the 1930s. So the biggest recent news on all things airborne from the WHO is from nearly 2 years ago, this April 2024 Global Technical Consultation Report on Proposed Terminology for Pathogens that Transmit Through the Air. One of the two chairs of the group that wrote this is Professor Hugo Allier, which we love to see. And this group also included many other airborne experts like Professors Moravska, Milton, and more. However, the report was also created in consultation with more traditional infectious disease specialists, such as recurring side character and dedicated defender of debunked droplet dogma, John Conley. Okay, thanks WHO. Anyways, I feel like the report's hybrid authorship and the fact that at the end of the day it is from the WHO themselves explains why it is, in my opinion, unsatisfying and not commensurate to the urgency of the topic at hand. Would you like to summarize this report, Ghost?
But of course, in the past, people in medicine and other scientific fields used very different words to describe the transmission of pathogens. Earlier in the COVID-19 pandemic, such terminological whoopsies by certain unnamed parties may have contributed to confusion and misinformation. Therefore, we would like to update the vocabulary to clear the air. All of us can certainly agree that some pathogens do travel through the air, and we think the phrase "through the air" is a good equivalent to terms like waterborne and bloodborne.
Why didn't they just use airborne?
Don't interrupt me.
Hey, geez.
These pathogens that travel through the air hitch a ride in what shall hereafter be known as infectious respiratory particles, or IRPs. IRPs exist on a continuous spectrum of sizes from less than a micron to millimeters in size, and everyone needs to stop trying to talk about a cutoff between aerosols and droplets. Stop trying to make cutoffs happen. Who would do such a thing? How far IRPs travel through and remain suspended in the air, and how long they stay infectious, varies based on many factors. More research is certainly needed. It's possible that the existence of IRPs may have implications for infection control measures and public health regulations, not only in healthcare settings, but in education, transport, workplaces, and commerce.
No shit.
Quiet. Here is what our group could not agree on. If it is indeed true, as we, the WHO, henceforth say is true, that smaller IRPs are capable of being transmitted at both short and long distances, then if one were to apply the precautionary principle, one would have to conclude that our existing infection control guidelines are woefully inadequate. However, if one were to ignore the precautionary principle, maybe everything is fine, actually. Ultimately, before the aforementioned updates in airborne infection terminology could be possibly shared more widely, research is necessary on the ramifications and feasibility of informing healthcare workers and the public about these complex developments in the arrangement and use of words. In conclusion, our report explicitly contains no recommendations on mitigating the spread of diseases that transmit through the air, and please do not interpret this report as suggesting at all that maybe people should be protected from inhaling airborne pathogens. The end.
Thank you, Ghost. So basically, if the WHO wants to confidently share with the public premature conclusions about how a disease spreads, which could have dangerous consequences if they're incorrect, that's fine. But if the WHO later realizes that this dangerous statement was actually extremely incorrect, more research and training has to be done before this highly complex issue can be understood by healthcare workers and the general public. Did I get that right?
Now, Lola, when the WHO shared dangerous misinformation, it was an emergency with life or death consequences.
Wouldn't being in an emergency make it, even more important to not share misinformation and be on the safe side?
Look, in any case, there's hardly an emergency anymore, so I don't see why I should have to update people about things I messed up on, which require a lot more research about how to tell people that I messed up.
I really disagree on all counts, ghost of public health present. The COVID-19 pandemic never went away. The partial measures to prevent spread and track individual infections just ended. In fact, the virus continues to regularly surge all over the world at levels far higher than 2020 or most of 2021. Actually, the majority of infections have happened after 2021 in the supposed post-pandemic era. It's also now recognized that the acute and medium-term health consequences of COVID are a major issue that only 6-ish years in are affecting the quality of life of billions of people worldwide and leading to an estimated yearly global economic loss of $1 trillion, which is an important figure to include if you're speaking with ghouls for whom the health of the economy is the biggest concern at the end of the day. Similar figures about the economic cost of preventable infections are often cited by Professor Moravska in the many articles and editorials she publishes regularly about the need for indoor air quality regulations, which she has to keep publishing regularly because nothing is improving. In fact, all of the studies identifying the quiet, long-term damage repeated COVID infections are doing to everyone's bodies suggest that we will likely be facing far greater economic losses and mass morbidity in the future as more people develop chronic illnesses that could have been prevented. If you visit a doctor's office and there's signs urging people to use hand sanitizer to protect themselves, but there's nothing about masks, this is simply inadequate infection control considering what we now know about airborne spread and the ongoing high rates of airborne virus transmission. And while a lot more than just education for individual healthcare workers is needed to fix this, I also want to note that I think that individual healthcare workers, cancer doctors for children, nurses, home health aides, all of them, they mostly are not up to date on airborne transmission because the WHO hasn't even tried to educate them. In the ongoing UK COVID inquiry on September 16th, 2024, so well into the period of airborne spread being widely accepted by WHO leadership, top scientific journal editors, etc., Lisa Ritchie, the current head of infection prevention and control at the NHS, aka the person who has been leading decisions for infection control policy in the UK for the entire pandemic, under oath, says that as far as she knows, there's not enough evidence for airborne transmission of COVID-19 for healthcare workers to wear proper respirators in the N95 style. Unless they're doing aerosol generating procedures, which she, again, under oath, admits that she still falsely believes to create more aerosols than coughing. This is the person in charge of infection control in the UK right now. The Semmelweis Reflex is alive and the Welleses are rolling in their graves. And in the meantime, patients and healthcare workers are getting unnecessarily ill. And the most vulnerable and immunocompromised people can't safely access healthcare or other public places literally anywhere in the world, and kids are getting preventably ill at school en masse, not to mention the indoor fine particulate matter from pollution, which is also making people sick and which could also be mitigated with some of these same technologies that would help reduce airborne spread. All of this seems like a significant problem, no? And look, I know that the UN recently held an official side event to emphasize the need for action about indoor air quality, which is like, cool, it's possibly better than literally nothing. But astute observers might note that the UN is the parent of the World Health Organization, who've presumably been too busy the last 2 years researching the feasibility of campaigns to educate people about developments in vocabulary to make policy guidelines that might save lives. Meanwhile, the British Medical Association and CADA, which is an alliance of professional British healthcare worker organizations, have been begging the NHS and the UK Gov to update infection control guidelines in accordance with this new science to better protect workers and patients, with absolutely no results. Because Why would a national government go out of their way to spend money to protect people's health if the WHO doesn't even recommend it and there's no pressure from the public because most people don't even know that there's a problem? We can't seriously keep looking to these organizations to lead the charge on informing people about how badly they've been doing their jobs, right? Oh. They left. Look, I don't believe that we are going to get into air regulation that benefits all of us unless enough of us are aware of the issue and creating change ourselves. Our public health institutions are never going to come out and admit they messed up of their own will. We need to spread that knowledge ourselves because the necessary push for regulating clean indoor air using existing, well-understood technologies is not going to come from the institutions that have been getting it wrong for 100 years. I know that some people are probably like,
Oh my god, why would you criticize the World Health Organization and the US CDC now when public health is under the greatest threat it's ever been?
but to act like the only reason that public health is in danger now is that Trump is back in office and RFK Jr. appeared out of the woodwork, as if the WHO and the US CDC didn't pave the way for charismatic charlatans by repeatedly shooting themselves in the foot through ignoring the possibility of airborne spread and shutting down scientists who tried to warn them, by prematurely declaring that asymptomatic people and children couldn't spread COVID, by declaring that breakthrough infections would be super rare instead of accurately communicating the limitations and uncertainties about the new COVID vaccines, therefore creating a whole new generation of anti-vaxxers. Public health has made some mistakes in the last few centuries, as Semmelweis, Flüge, the Wellses, the retirement confessions of Alexander Langmuir, and the current experiences of airborne transmission experts show. If we want a resilient public health apparatus that is resistant to anti-public health grifters, public health institutions need to work on their problems at home. Like, the intruders who are trying to dismantle your house from the inside didn't get in because they're strategic genius mission impossible acrobats. They got in because you never installed a front door and left the whole back half of the building unfinished. The systematic rejection of the possibility of airborne transmission for over a century is not a fluke. It reveals some fundamental weaknesses in our existing public health structures, weaknesses that make them vulnerable to bad actors and conspiracy theorists. We can do better. Don't let your immediate frustration at the current moment limit your imagination for what is possible in a better future. And please do imagine better futures, because people who can only see doom don't bother to fight for a better world, which is a sure way to support the status quo and produce that doom. Also, don't forget history, both distant and recent, when you try to understand why things are so bad. Share this video with your friends or talk to your family about how shocking and wild this history is. If you're part of a group organizing community care or advocating for the environment or pushing for change in one of the many aspects of our society that are deeply flawed, tell people about this problem. Tell them that, like the old-timey folks who were unwittingly drinking poop water, we are breathing in crappy air full of pathogens and pollutants and unsafe CO2 concentrations, when we could totally have something better if there was actually pressure on the institutions that have been failing us and more people were working to create livable futures. And in the meantime, you can make your events and gatherings and spaces safer by opening some windows, making sure your HVAC system has an adequate filter and isn't just recirculating indoor air, or crowdfunding some air purifiers, staying home when you're sick, and yes, using high-quality respirators in public spaces that you think all people deserve to exist safely in. Thanks for watching. I'm Lola Germs, and I am positive that we can do better. Air. I forgot the line. One moment, please. Air. I just need to read the line on the teleprompter. It's literally right in front of me.
Oh boy, I can't wait to hang out with my girlfriends at the munitions factory.
Correspond to different physical processes of creation in Oh, nice to see you. Oh, I don't remember what the line is. And this response is incredible. This response is incredible. Incredible. It's incredible.